Sorry? Yeah. Yeah. It's in the tracker. Do you want it? No, just things are going slowly. My machine is like that. Good morning, everyone. Brave people of Friday morning and being scheduled against Quick and still being here. That's great. Thanks so much. So while you are so dedicated, I am sure it will not be hard to find a note taker and a Jabber scribe. We have a note taker, perfect, and we have a Jabber scribe. Someone willing to Jabber scribe? Jabber scribe? Do I need to ask the last person to come in to be the Jabber scribe? You want me to do it? What do you want to do? No, I'm asking. No, I can't find my mouse. But if you want to do it, just so. Shall I do it over the video? Okay, now I got it. Oh, great. Oh, no, I don't think so. Hello, everyone. Welcome very much to the Human Rights Protocols Considerations meeting, Friday morning, July 21st. Also, welcome to the remote participants. We got quite a full agenda here and a bit different schedule from normal. We made two changes in the schedule as discussed on the list, is that we have a longer session than normally because we often ran out of time. And instead of having 3 or 4 speakers for inspiration, we took one, so we would have more time for discussion and we would go into a bit more depth. I'm also happy at the end to see whether you think this is a useful model, we should revert back, or we should go about otherwise. Here are the administrivia. We have a note taker. Do we already have a volunteer for the Jabber scribe? We have a Jabber scribe. Excellent, thanks so much. Please join the mailing list if you haven't done so already. Pull requests for drafts are welcome in GitHub. You can find the intros, the minutes, and the website there. As said, we have quite a full agenda. Does anyone have any other points for the agenda? Agenda bashing. 1, 2, approved. Here we go. So this is the note well. If you haven't noted it well, then you haven't noted so well during this whole week, because it's Friday morning. So if you have any IPR claims you would like to make, or you have any IPR things for anything you'd like to present, please tell us now, because else it's too late. So as always, it's very important that you review documents, not only because then we can have a more informed discussion, but also the quality of the IETF documents depends on your reviews. So please review documents in your own working group, also in other working groups, and then we will also review your documents. Yeah. So the Standard Research Group, we have been quite busy. We have been working on the topic since IETF 91. We've been a proposed research group since IETF 92, and you see we have a pretty consistent production of work, actually with a smart increase in the number of drafts, and also continuously new things coming, about which you'll also see things in the presentation a bit. So what we're trying to do, as is in our charter, is to expose the relationship between protocols and human rights, with an initial focus on the right to freedom of expression and the freedom of assembly. We've tried to propose guidelines and also see how those guidelines could work in practice, and also to increase the awareness of both the human rights community and the technical community about the importance of technical workings of the internet and its impact on human rights. And then I'd like to start off with a presentation and Q&A with Milton Muller. Milton is professor at Georgia Tech, the author famously of Network and States and Ruling the Root. And he's going to tell us his findings that he's working on with a paper with Farzaneh Badieh, also from Georgia Tech. Milton.
Give him the clicker, right?
Yeah.
Yep.
See, this was set for Niels. Well, thank you. I'm very pleased to be here, and I'd particularly like to thank Avi and Niels for inviting me. I think it's very interesting that they were so eager to have the discussion. I do want to say that the idea for this paper was, in fact, Farzaneh's, and she couldn't be here today. She has a bit of a human rights problem. Being Iranian and living in the U.S., she's afraid to leave, or at least was until the Supreme Court settled that issue, we hope. So, so I'm here giving this talk, and it's called Requiem for a Dream. Just to give you a brief summary of the somewhat provocative points we want to make. First of all, we want to subject the belief that we can promote and protect human rights through protocols and standards or architectures to some critical assessment. And I, in particular, have a very long background, being an old guy in science, technology, and society studies and history of technology. And you'll see the intersection of that discipline to what you're doing here. We think there are tendencies within this push that oversimplify the complex relationship between technology and society, and that you all might benefit from this critical assessment. Fundamentally, we believe that human rights are primarily a political and institutional accomplishment and cannot be reduced to a matter of technical design, although we, of course, believe that technology disequilibrates existing institutions and alters the way society works. It's not simply a matter of technical design. And there are also some disturbing aspects, or potentially negative aspects, of the trying to make policy or protect or enable rights through your technical designs. So let me first try to characterize the views that we are criticizing. And the fact of the matter is, we quickly discover that there is not a simple or uniform statement here that is some clearly theoretically derived position. We have a spectrum of views. So at one extent, some people are asserting that human rights can be protected by design or through the internet protocols. And given that, technologists have a moral and legal responsibility to do so. This in particular is coming from sort of international law scholars like Corinne Kath and Floridi, who are very steeped in the Universal Declaration of Human Rights. So that's another aspect of this. Many people within this group are very eager to connect not just generic things like privacy or freedom of expression, but very specifically the actual Universal Declaration of Human Rights of the United Nations. They believe that that can be enabled through the internet protocols, or as one of them put it, quote, baked into the architecture at design time. Now, a slightly weaker and probably a lot more practical statements of what you're trying to do come from your own HRPC document. I don't know whether to call it an RFC or not, because
no, it's not yet.
I don't think it is. So it talks about internet connectivity as enabling human rights. In other words, taking a technological or creating a technological capability that advances freedom of expression. And there's a statement in there that the architectural design of the internet converges with the human rights framework, which we frankly don't know what that means. There's another statement that the human rights enabling characteristics of the internet might be degraded if they are not properly defined, described, and sufficiently taken into account in protocol development. So that is, again, a step back from the harder position that human rights can be protected by design. What they're saying here is, let's be aware of impacts or potential impacts when we're developing protocols. To try to relate this to the academic literature, we find that there are sort of two distinct positions here. One of them is a stronger claim. The famous claim, at least made famous by Lessig, but developed by others before him, that code is law. And there's a somewhat weaker and we think more accurate claim that the technology mediates human rights. That is, it is a kind of an intermediary between the accomplishment of rights on the one hand and the technical, the efforts by people to use it in ways that either compromise or advance human rights. And that latter point is, I think, articulated in Laura DeNardis's work. And of course, the code is law claim has a lot of precedents, including Lessig, Joel Reidenberg, Mitchell, somebody named Mitchell, who I don't even know, was probably the first to articulate that claim. Now, just to sort of summarize the differences in the two perspectives, with the code as law, you're focusing on the ex-ante initial design of the protocols or the architecture, whereas with the other perspective, you're focusing more on ex-post attempts. The infrastructure is in place, and people are trying to do things to it that either compromise human rights or advance human rights. For example, DeNardis and others have frequently focused on the famous SOPA and PIPA laws, which were trying to use domain name system blocking to enforce copyright or prevent copyright infringement in the United States. Now, this is clearly not a design, really a redesign of internet protocols. That was an ex-post attempt to use the capabilities of the infrastructure to block or filter certain kinds of things that were perceived as violating copyright. The code and law perspective is fairly linear and deterministic. Essentially, it asserts that whoever makes the design makes the rules, and you're all kind of bound by them. Whereas the other perspective has more of a two-way relationship in mind, and they view the infrastructure as a site of struggle over rights. And this struggle, we believe, is as much, if not more, political than technical. So with that characterization, sort of the theory and practice, we'll now go into our critique. Well, the first thing that we notice, and again, this point is certainly contestable at some point, but for a very large extent, the internet is already designed. Its basic architecture is in place. This is not to say that it doesn't change, that there aren't marginal adjustments and changes, that there aren't new standards, but any kind of protocol development that's going on now in the IETF is not going to have an immediate and major impact on the way things work, much less on the degree to which human rights are enabled over the internet. There's something also interesting about that is, you know, if indeed new standards or new processes within IETF are needed to protect human rights, it seems to indicate that its current architecture does not necessarily protect human rights, that this again is more of a site of struggle rather than baked into the architecture. The second problem is we have some difficulty understanding the extremely strong linkage that is asserted between the UDHR and international law and the technical architecture. That is to say, if you say, I am trying to protect, through my protocol, the confidentiality of data, I know what that means very clearly. If you're saying, I'm trying to protect the right of privacy as defined in the UDHR, I'm not sure I do know what you mean. If you say, I'm trying to protect the entire set of human rights enshrined in this standard, I'm absolutely sure I have no idea what you mean by that. Because the UDHR and the whole complex of international human rights law is extremely extensive and complex. It was formulated in fairly imprecise terms. Not all of the rights in there, for example, the right to a job, I'm not sure you're going to help that with your protocol development. Maybe the right to developers to a job might be in some way advanced by what you do here. But some rights, as the committee here recognizes in their document, are not that relevant to ICTs or connectivity. So again, that's a big step back from the general claim about human rights. Now, even the rights that you consider to be the most relevant to the internet contain serious internal conflicts. So one of the obvious ones is free expression versus privacy. The Human Rights Declaration says that everybody, you know, the famous Article 19, after which I think Niels has tattooed on his forehead somewhere, says that, you know, freedom of expression, everybody has a right to seek and impart information regardless of frontiers. It's great. It's one of my favorite formulations of the right to freedom of expression. But then later on it says everybody has the right not to be defamed, to not have their reputation besmirched by others. And so those two things can obviously clash. So how do you do that in a protocol? Free expression versus intellectual property is actually a recognized human right. And it's ironic that many of the people who are in the forefront of the theoretical work on this human rights and protocol development connection were people who were resisting the attempt by copyright owners to bake copyright protection into the internet infrastructure. And there's clearly, they were doing this kind of on free expression grounds and on differences over the scope of intellectual property rights. So again, it's not clear that there's a linear or simple relationship between these rights and the protocols or even the infrastructure. due process for the accused versus swift justice for victims. You could view that as kind of a tension, if not a contradiction. Obviously, human rights puts great emphasis on due process, but it's also a human rights issue that if you don't catch bad people who do evil things, so there's a tension there. Now again, the HPRC people are not naive. They recognize this in their documents, but to my mind, the response is quite lame. They're sort of saying, well, you need to balance them. Okay, how are they balanced? How are they balanced in a protocol? This is not clear to me. Decisions on design and deployment need to take rights conflicts into account. Okay. What does that mean, to take them into account? How do you reconcile them? How do you bake these rights into the architecture when you are when you have these conflicts and needs for balances? So that is what we consider to be one of the major issues with the linkage that's being forged. Problem 3, probably this won't be too controversial. Code is not law. Okay. And to understand this, you simply have to ask yourself, where does code come from? It's not purely exogenous. It doesn't drop down from the sky. Whoever writes code is responding to economic incentives, almost certainly, probably political, doing it in a political environment under certain kinds of legal and political constraints. So there's a reciprocal relationship between what code gets written and the surrounding society. And in fact, code and architecture can be, and often are, overridden by laws and regulations. And so a good example of this comes right here from the IETF and the famous interaction that this group had with the CALIA, which is in the US called the Communications Assistance for Law Enforcement Act. Now, if you remember, sometime in the early 90s, the telephone system started getting digitized, and the wiretapping technologies of the law enforcement agencies and intel agencies realized that their techniques were not able to capture information the same way. So a law was passed in 1994, and this is really before the internet was a big thing, perceived as a widespread mass medium. So they passed a law forcing US telephone companies to redesign their network architecture to facilitate wiretapping of telephone calls by law enforcement. And then, of course, the internet became a big thing, and the law enforcement agencies noticed that they didn't have any such capabilities for the internet. And when the IETF was working on standards for voice over IP and related things, somebody suggested to them, I've seen assertions that the FBI asked the IETF, but I've never found any verification of this request. But certainly there was discussion of what to do about whether their standards for voice over IP should be made CALIA compliant. And so they formed the famous Raven Working Group. I think it was in October or November of 1999, and it concluded in May of 2000. And the IETF basically said, no thanks, we're not going to rewrite our standards to make them compliant with a US law. As you probably remember, the main reason for that was not so much human rights per se, although the tenor of the group was very, very pro-privacy, pro-individual rights, and anti-government, anti-surveillance. But they basically said, we're a global standards organization, and we're not going to write standards to the specifications of one government. So did that settle the matter? Did we have successfully protect privacy on the internet? Well, of course, what happened next is that in 2004 and 2005, all of the law enforcement agencies went before the US Federal Communications Commission and filed a petition to expand CALIA to broadband providers, voice over IP telephony, and instant messaging. Of course, these laws would only apply to US-based providers or people with a major jurisdictional nexus in the US. And of course, the Civil rights, civil liberties groups opposed these requests. The Electronic Frontier Foundation in particular was in the forefront of the opposition. But this was post 9/11 America, and surveillance won politically over privacy and individual rights. So we got a CALEA compliant broadband providers. However, the technology of the internet was sufficiently diverse, complex, and changing that there was continued to be this struggle over surveillance and privacy, as you all well know. Indeed, in this period, the FBI and the NSA continue to claim that they're going dark, and privacy advocates continue to worry about the massive scope of surveillance on the internet. So what lessons would I draw from the CALEA case? Well, one of them, obvious ones, is that the so-called bad guys or the anti-human rights forces can use the standards process too. They can specify, you know, let's get into the IETF and try to urge them to do something. Let's go to the regulator and tell them to pass new standards that are compulsory. So there's nothing about doing things via standards that makes it pro-human rights. The other conclusion is that code was code and law was law. The IETF's refusal to make its architecture modifications did not settle the matter by itself. And after the FCC intervention, there were some law dictating code. And then we saw norms, code, law, and markets working together as elements in a political struggle over privacy. Here's another problem we do want you to consider, and that is if standards developers do think of themselves as being in the business of translating, protecting, and balancing legal and political rights, then they are, or might be considered by others, de facto policymakers. And if that, in fact, happens, then others, besides human rights advocates, will become interested in your standards and protocol development and enter into this arena where things are shaped. And indeed, in the current environment, we think that standards and protocol developers might open themselves up to the charge that they lack legitimacy, that is to say, political legitimacy or democratic legitimacy to define, enable, enforce, or balance rights. It doesn't seem outlandish for me to imagine that if indeed you find yourselves actively shaping human rights in a way that really tilts the social environment in the way that you want, that you might find governments knocking on your door and saying, well, maybe you should have some representatives of our point of view in your committees. Forget about technical expertise. You guys are in the policy business. Why can't we have a, somebody from the Ministry of Communications of Moldova here, because we have a perspective on what rights should be protected and how they should be protected. As we said earlier, the argument that technology mediates rights is, we think, more accurate and more useful because it better captures the reciprocal influence between technology and society. But we view much of the current literature on this topic as being somewhat ahistorical. In effect, they might be even trying to reinvent the history of technology or science, technology, and society studies, because this argument is true of every technology, not just the internet. Regulation and control, or the level to which you achieve rights and freedom, are always dependent in some ways upon the specific technical features of the communications medium. And I'm going to give you two historical examples of this. So one, of course, is the printing press. And if you go back to the 15th century and read some early discussions of printing technology, this was certainly perceived by Protestant Reformationists as a technology of liberation. And indeed it was for a while, because it allowed, dissident groups like Protestants to disseminate their views in mass form in ways that gave them a competitive advantage over the old stodgy Catholic Church. And kings and princes were also challenged by this. So what happened? Well, the government started to clamp down on printing presses through various mechanisms. One of the most simpler ones was simply to arrest dissidents and put them in jail or kill them, which goes on today, of course. But sometimes they tried to exert more systematic economic control over the printing press, for example, by licensing presses and awarding monopolies to particular publishers to publish specific kinds of books. Particularly in England, the printing press was highly licensed until I think the early 18th or 19th century. Case of radio broadcasting is equally interesting. What you have is a technical feature of radio communication, namely the control of the radio spectrum. And governments asserted control or nationalized the spectrum in order to achieve control over broadcasting technology. In the US, broadcasting was essentially not entirely anarchic. People were coordinating what frequencies they used, but it was extremely open, and there were all kinds of new broadcasters pouring onto the airwaves in the early 20s. And the government stepped in and effectively nationalized the airwaves and used its control of licensing broadcasters to impose a number of regulations, particularly pertaining to content and other kinds of performance metrics on the broadcasting industry. And of course, in most of Europe, simply you had a single national broadcaster. So in all of the early stages of these technologies, and what I'm suggesting is kind of a historical cycle here, these technologies were technologies of freedom indeed, not so much because of specific technical architecture made them promote freedom, but because they were new technologies and the state didn't know how to control them yet. And this is particularly true of the internet, where we had, it just kind of burst onto the scene unexpectedly, bypassing telecom monopolies and bypassing national barriers to censorship and control. And of course, later on, states learned, how can we control this? What can we do to stop this? What can we do to stop that? So you really have to pay attention to the historical trajectory of the technology. It is important to understand how and why these technologies broke out of the chains of previous technologies, but it's also important to understand that inevitably those who want to control will discover new ways to control, just as people who want to evade control will discover new ways to evade control. So that leads to one of my final points, which is that design is ex ante. It happens before the fact. And rights violations are really ex post, and knowledge of how they occur and where they occur is really after the fact. So true assessment of human rights impact of various technical developments can only occur after the fact. And standards or protocols that seem to be secure or protective at the moment of design may actually have unintended consequences. They may be exploited in ways that you don't anticipate. Or creative people may think of ways to subvert them in ways that you did think of but didn't quite work. So we, again, would emphasize a view of rights and technology as being an ongoing struggle, very much influenced by economics and politics as well as by standards. One of the objectives that we've heard from people involved in the HRPC is that they want to change the language that you're using to describe the technologies. But we're not sure that simply changing the language will have any actual impact on human rights on the internet. Again, it might make you more aware of certain things, but by itself, the change of language will not have much of an effect. So to conclude, we don't want anybody to go away thinking that we're against human rights. We're in favor of human rights. And in particular, I mean, I have to qualify that statement. I'm very much in favor of freedom of expression, privacy, the classic civil and political rights. I don't know about all of those things that are classified as human rights under human rights law. But the idea that you all are in a very powerful position to advance those rights through internet protocol design, I think is needs to be moderated and looked at soberly. So the idea is not to discourage you from being aware of human rights or to believe or to in any way divert you from a commitment to those rights. It's simply to challenge unrealistic expectations that could, in fact, backfire in certain ways and otherwise might lead you to waste a lot of energy on things that are not really where the action is. So, open it up to discussion.
Thank you. So I don't see anybody at the microphone. I don't know, Niels, whether you had any comments. Someone is coming to the microphone. Thank you. Please remember to give your name at the beginning.
Hi there, my name is Andrew Sullivan. So I guess it probably won't be too surprising that I'm somewhat sympathetic to this description of the issues, and in particular, I think some of us were a little nervous during this work because of problem, I think, 4 that you mentioned about sort of involving the standards process directly in political tussles. But I wonder whether there is a more generous reading of the not quite RFC. And that is to read it as just an exhortation to protocol designers to think about the consequences of potential technical trade-offs they make for any given rights situation. And if it's just that seems a little less controversial. That you can make decisions that can have potentially rights enabling, if you believe in rights enabling consequences or rights disabling consequences, and maybe part of the difficulty is there's a little bit of a tension in the text sometimes between the more exhortatory kind of version of it and the more optimistic version that I think you were critiquing. So I don't know if you have anything to say about that. Thanks.
Yeah, I think that the conversation I had with Aubrey was very enlightening to me because in some sense, when you're talking about enabling, you're creating technologies that enable, again, I think that's great. And I think that the internet did indeed enable Article 19 of human rights by creating this global connectivity. And that was a fantastic achievement, and we should all support it. And I wouldn't have wanted policymakers or international lawyers to have any kind of a gatekeeping function over that. I think the great thing about what the internet community did was they created this capability and didn't worry about the consequences. They just did it, and that advanced human society greatly. But whenever you create a capability, you don't really know how it's going to be used completely. It could be used by people for purposes that you don't really know, and we're certainly learning that now about the internet. So in terms of the awareness of possible impacts, and again, you have to be modest about your ability to know, I think it's great to encourage the considerations, the aspects, the awareness. I have no problem with that at all. But again, just be modest about the ex ante versus ex post problem, and realize that things that you do now might actually be used in ways that just really appall you later.
Hi, Bob Hinden. It's been a little while since we chatted last. So 2 things. The thing at the beginning where you said that the internet is basically static. So there's a lot of truth in that, but it's not the whole truth. I mean, I think the recent work the IETF has been doing on, ubiquitous encryption and privacy, I think, it seems very in line with human rights to make it harder for people to look at traffic I mean, there's a big tussle going on right now with TLS, with the new version of TLS, as to how easy or hard it is for middle boxes to look at the encrypted traffic. So, I mean, and that's a very active discussion here. So there is still a lot of things that I think affect human rights going on here today. So it's not completely static. Obviously, it's the basic packet switching architecture hasn't changed too much. And the other thing, I've always thought for a long time that when you design technology, or in this case protocols, you are making policy decisions. You may not be quite aware of it, but what the capabilities you build in those protocols or the capabilities you don't build in affect what can be done with them. And that's very much a policy. I mean, it starts from the whole creation of packet switching was a giant policy, compared to what the telcos were doing with circuit switching ahead of time. And it's allowed a lot of things that you couldn't do. It certainly made, I think, wiretapping harder. Because packets are more distributed than they used to be. So, I think policy and technology choices are not these two separate domains. There's not the policy people and then the protocol designers. There's a lot of overlap here. And I agree, it's good that when we do design, we give this some consideration. It's hard to know exactly how it applies, but, it's worth thinking about.
Yeah, I think by the same token, when you say that you're making policy decisions, do you want policymakers looking over your shoulder as you make those decisions? Or do you want to be solving, let's not even call it solving technical problems, do you want to be creating technical capabilities and you want a free hand to do that? Or do you want governments and political representation to constrain you in those choices?
My personal answer to that is no. I'd like to do what we think is right, but they do have policy impacts.
Yeah, I don't doubt that they do. It's just that you probably don't know exactly what they are.
Georg Meyer, I have a few comments. I think it's a bit too straightforward to think like the IP revolution or internet revolution is like the radio or the free press, because we're much more flexible. And I understand that on the lower layers, maybe the technology isn't changed that often. But when you look now at what's going on in terms of cloudifications on higher layers, where also human rights most likely need protection, we're changing the architecture every few years. New ideas come in. So I think there we have always a possibility to rethink what we really want and build in capabilities that we would like to have there. On the policymakers, what you just said, I think they are already in the room. So there's, I mean, you can't say, oh, they should stay out or whatever. They are in the room. And we have, I'm mainly active in other standards organizations, not so much the IETF, but we heavily reusing what the IETF is providing. And I think that's practically a trend all over the world, or all of standards or network standards that is done these days is whatever the IETF standardizes is de facto the thing to take for the sort of communication. So the regulators, the governments, whatever, they are very active in other standards bodies, much more than here. That's my understanding, my feeling. And from that, I see that the IETF has quite momentum to use its capabilities to bring human rights issues, whatever issues, into their protocols to make sure they are there. And the other bodies simply have to live with that, at least at the moment. And I think this is something we should take into consideration. We should keep in our mind that the IETF, from my perspective, can really make a difference here. Thank you.
Just one question for you, maybe stay at the mic for a second. So when you say the architecture changes every 2 years or so, what are you defining as architecture?
depends. I mean, like as you see now, when we talk about everywhere about virtualization, talk about what was a big issue in this this IETF slicing, the whole thing that everything moves into the cloud, so things are not anymore on the, or not only, let's say, on the client. These are all movements that, I mean, I don't say this is something that is good for human rights or bad, but we have to rethink human rights on that basis, right? And we really have to see how can we implement things into this movement. So that doesn't mean that therefore the transport layer or physical layers sort of resolved all the other problems, but at least on those levels that we're currently working, we should keep our eyes open.
Yeah, I don't have any fundamental disagreement with that. I think I would just emphasize that maybe you've made a bunch of technical decisions incrementally over the last 10 years that have enabled this movement to the cloud. And this movement to the cloud is going to have a number of policy, competition implications that there's no way you could really design for in your protocols. There, you need to massive levels of concentration, which requires some kind of regulatory response by antitrust or competition policy regulators. But that's not really your problem to solve. But even though it's an indirect outgrowth of your a whole series of technical decisions.
I just want to say I understand that you say it's not our task, but when you see the discussions that were, for example, when it came to TLS, this is sort of made our task because some people want certain things that others don't want. So maybe if you say it's not our task, yes, from a technical point of view, maybe, but the confrontation is brought here anyhow.
Well, I totally agree that when it comes to the TLS issue, what you're doing is you're saying we are designing for confidentiality, which is a classic part of the triad of information security, and I'm all for that. The question is, there are going to be countervailing forces. Maybe the TLS mechanisms you come up with will, some states will say you can't use those, and they'll try to regulate their infrastructure to prevent that. Others might find new ways to get around it. That's all I'm saying, is that you're not settling the issue by creating these more secure points in the network. Last but not least.
Thanks so much for this, Milton, and thanks so much for the reference to. Eating the mic. Thanks so much, Milton. I thanks also for the reference to the movie, a Requiem for a Dream. I'm afraid that this now slowly starts to become a more of Inception, because I'm going to tell you to wake up from your dream, and then you're going to tell me to wake up from your dream. So let's see how meta we can get. But let me go back to the last time when I thought I was awake, as a reference, and that was at the previous IETF. And that's where we had a talk from Dave Clark, who said, and who's also the author of the famous tussle paper, who said, there is a tussle. And that is something that you seem to acknowledge here as well. And I think what we've been saying in the draft, we need to make the tussle more explicit. So my question would be here, what are you adding to that discussion? Because as others have said, there are already policymakers here. There are already nation states here pushing their influences with the Raven process. So that you've seen, we have also seen the weakening of crypto standards. We've seen now also the explicit request for the weakening of crypto standards. There have also been other requests. So I think that you seem to describe the policy layer as a separate layer, whereas it's integrated through the whole stack. And I'm a bit surprised that you, as a science and technology scholar, haven't mentioned the concept affordances, because the network and the technology always has specific characteristics which inhibits or stimulates or enables or disables a certain behavior. And you're completely right that you cannot completely predict that, but it doesn't mean you cannot think about it. And it doesn't mean you cannot model it. It doesn't mean you're going to be right, but you can take that into account in your analysis. And with the internet, there is also not so much an ex post and an ex ante, but it's an ex durante. You know, we are continuously evolving the network, and we have no idea how it's going to be used. There was a sudden uptick of decentralized BitTorrent protocols, and then it seemed that distribution was going to be much stronger. But now we see a very big tendency towards centralization on many different layers of the stack. And you say that's not your problem. Well, it is our problem if that leads to a less resilient network. And so that's when we need to start thinking, what can we do about that? So I think it definitely has influences on what we do here. And then your reference to the printing press and the radio, I was very surprised, but also it was great. Because the printing press initially was embraced by the Catholic Church, because then finally they did not depend on monks to copy, and they could distribute, and they thought, finally now everyone is going to have a Bible and we're going to have ultra dominance. Well, it turned out differently. Right?
Exactly.
And what Bertolt Brecht said a bit before you in 1928 was that the promise of radio can only be fulfilled if the listener is able to talk back. And that is exactly what we're working on now with the internet. So everything has specific affordances, and you see different ways in which control is possible and which control is harder. So we've seen, for instance, the possibility of shortwave radio made the distribution of news much easier. But then there, of course, was jamming. But jamming was still a very large economic investment to do. So you're also making it harder for people to censor. That's also work that we're doing here, and we've seen now the discussion on the of SNI headers, etc., which also and the work on LS, which makes censorship harder. So I think there are definitely affordances there, and not just on privacy and confidentiality. I have some more points, but I think I'll leave it with that for now.
Well, I'm not sure what your point about the historical things are, except to reinforce my point that there's an ongoing struggle on the side of these technologies. The Catholic Church thought the printing press was, you know, they assumed, oh, we control things. And, but the economic affordances of the printing press said, you know, almost anybody can make one of these things and start cranking stuff. And now you connect that to a dissident movement of Protestantism, and suddenly you've got something out of control. And then you start to get a more systematic, institutionalized regime of press control, which lasts for 200 years. The same thing with broadcasting. Brecht apparently didn't know that, I guess he was thinking about only about broadcasting, but broadcasting was preceded and pioneered by, you know, early 1900s hackers known as radio amateurs, and they were talking to each other. That was the whole point. They were using short waves to bounce signals around, establish contact with people all over the world, and it was the radio amateurs who suddenly just got this brilliant idea of connecting their record player to their transmitter and start broadcasting music. And again, you had an extremely diverse and open development of the radio for about 5 years, and then became institutionalized and controlled through the technical leverage that they achieved by allocating and assigning radio frequencies. So I don't see, you know, how you're challenging my point.
So I say that there are different affordances to the different technologies. And the way in which the internet is governed makes it harder, and that's also part of the later discussion on the draft political, is that the processes in which we can be controlled and can be influenced are different. And then we get back to the tussle, that here we can make the tussle more explicit, and can seek to counterbalance it. And
I got to say something about the tussle. So I was there when he gave this paper at the Telecom Policy Research Conference, way about 2002 or something like that. And to us, that was like, oh, so the engineers have discovered policy struggle. You know, it's like, what you want to call it tussle? That's cute. That resonates with the engineers, but this is what we do. This is what we talk about for the last 200 years. This is political economy. So of course there's tussles over technology, just like there's tussles over, you know, healthcare or, you know, other kinds of public policy considerations.
Allison Mankit. So I'm I work for Salesforce, our IETF chair, and I don't want, since we have some time, I'm interested to know how people in this room, especially you, think of the parallel effort that's going on about values and bias in algorithms. And there too, there's a very strong engineering component to the discussion, and the kind of need for the alliance among parties. It's not just a dominant, it's not just policy folks, government folks, but also, say, journalists. And I think there's play for that, the fourth estate here too. So I thought maybe give us some comments about that.
Yeah, so the algorithmic regulation issue, I think, is simply an extension of the overall idea that, you know, you create a capability, right? And then you find out what it does. And some of the things that it does are unanticipated, and some of them may be bad, and some of them may be fantastic. And then society starts to adjust to those capabilities based on what it learns about what happened with your first pass. And this was the state we're in now. You know, we had this great Google search algorithm, and then we discovered various ways it could be gamed, or various ways it might produce discriminatory results. And so now people are wanting to dig into those and make them more transparent. And the possibility or capabilities of regulating algorithms needs to be also tempered by the concept of you know, reward innovations. So if you develop this great algorithm that does wonderful things, but then you have to expose it to everybody and you have no sort of intellectual property protection for it, then you might be deterred from developing other algorithms. So there's no free lunch in terms of regulating its capability. You have to be very careful how you do that. That's my perspective. I think there's probably people here who know more about that than I do. We haven't really focused on the algorithmic regulation very much in our research.
Philip Erdley, I just wanted to follow up on the earlier comment about how the architecture's changed. To me, the big thing that's changing was maybe unexpected 15, 20 years ago. We thought it would be, we'd end up with something that was highly distributed and lots of people in there garages writing applications and things. We actually ended up with huge economies of scale. So it's ended up with monopoly, basically. Or that's the big trend, isn't it? To have a monopoly in a particular application area. You're seeing more and more monopolies in terms of the technology because it becomes so expensive to build or make the chips that are fast enough, etc. So, I mean, and that must have big implications for human rights, I guess. So.
Yeah, I really, you may be talking about what Tim Wu calls the cycle. I don't know how many of you are familiar with that book, but I don't endorse everything in it, but it does have a very important point, which is that all of these technologies go through this phase, and then in the early stages, there's lots of small-scale innovation going on. It's a very free environment, and then the basic structures are discovered, and what works and what doesn't work is discovered. You get some consolidation, then you get institutionalization and some kind of ties to the government and more rigid regulation. And then maybe somebody comes along with a disruptive innovation that sets that equilibrium, 10, 20 years down the road, maybe 50 years down the road. For example, with the telephone system, it took a really long time to break out of the monopoly that was formed around analog circuit switch technology in the 1920s. So the internet is really following this same pattern in many ways. I think you're right that we thought it was going to be completely distributed and essentially various forms of consolidation and concentration have occurred and are occurring. And again, that's more economic structure than human rights, but I believe that the economic factors actually have as much impact on freedom as the nominal legal rights. That if you have an environment where you have a monopoly, it doesn't matter a whole lot what your nominal legal rights are. You really don't have many options to exercise. You don't have a lot of freedom. So,
Thank you.
all right.
I think that's a great note to end on. Thank you, Milton, for coming and talking about a paper that you're still working on. I really appreciate you coming and speaking to this group about it, and look forward to reading the paper when you and Farzaneh and you have completed it. So thanks a lot. Okay, moving on. Okay, so the next thing we have is, I guess you're talking about, Niels, your paper on HRPC anonymity.
Well, we talked about this draft in the last meeting, and it was me actually setting up a structure about things we talked, and then some people wanted to take it on. There is not a new version out, so I wanted to check in with the room if anyone is interested in working on this, whether we should pursue this further, and if people are interested in working on this.
I don't see any hands. Oh, okay.
Stefan Bortsmeyer. Last time I said I was interested, but in practice, I didn't do anything. So if someone else wants to step in, great. Otherwise, I'll try to resume, but don't hold your breath.
I saw one hand in the back, and that's Tarakia. So, and that would be good. So we'll be in touch about how to get involved in working on it. Don't know where else you want to go with that one.
No, that's great.
That's where you wanted to go with it. Okay.
Yeah, that's great. Progress. So then we go to the next draft, which will be presented by Gisela Perez de Hacha. Gisela, are you in the remote room, and can you put yourself in the queue so we can put you on the screen?
Hi, can you see me?
Yes, we can see you. Excellent.
Yeah,
welcome.
Perfect. Thank you, Niels. Hi, everybody. I am Gisela from Derechos Digitales. I am connecting from Mexico. It's 3:30 a.m. here. It's not warm, so I'm really jealous of everybody that is in Prague right now. I'm going to present the internet draft that I've been working on with Niels about freedom of association and internet infrastructure. Can I have the next slide, please? Perfect. So we talked a bit about it the last session. The objective was to document forms of assembly and association that included protests that did not have a negative impact on the internet infrastructure. This started thought out like that because apparently there's a consensus at the Human Rights Protocols Considerations Research Group that denial of services attacks are not to be promoted by the IETF because they damage the internet architecture. So we were wondering, how does the internet architecture enable and/or inhibit the freedom of association and assembly, including protest, that is encompassed by these rights, along with many other rights like freedom of speech and even privacy. So very quickly, the difference between assembly and association is just a question of matter of degree. An assembly is rather temporary, and an association is a bit more formal and less ephemeral. While we were working through this, we came with a we came up with a very interesting concept, that was the concept of forced association, that has echoes with the internet architecture itself, because these rights are envisioned as freedoms, which means that nobody is supposed to be forced to join a group or even forced to leave a group. It's just a freedom. You can either join or leave whatever group you choose, either temporary or permanent. Also, another thing that we've been discussing, we haven't quite reached consensus, and it would be super interesting to see what you think, is if the internet itself was an association, an assembly, or an association. Let's just treat it as synonyms right now. Because if it is, it should be protected by these rights, and that has other impacts on, let's say, other kinds of networks, right? So if the internet is a network, an association and an assembly are also essentially networks. So we were wondering, and we're still wondering, if this is something that we can definitely assert. Next, please. Well, just as a side note, the IETF is an assembly. We could even consider an association, even though not in an association doesn't have to be a corporation, or it doesn't even have to be legally constructed. It can just be a bit more formal and a bit more permanent. And RFC 3233 defines the IETF as an open global community of network designers, operators, vendors, and researchers. So in this sense, IETF is definitely an assembly and association protected by these rights. Next, please. Even the mere discussion of RFCs would not be possible without these human rights. And just as a historical side note, the World Protocol found its way into language of computer networking because of this need of collective agreement. Next, please. So we mapped out a bunch of cases and examples, but I really want to emphasize the difference between free association and forced association, because I think it's one of the most interesting ones that we've been able to come up with, starting by the text of the ICCPR and the UDHR, and then taking it to the internet architecture and see how one impacts the other, and how the text impacts or could be interpreted in terms of internet architecture. So free association, it's very easy. Let's just think about mailing lists. You join a mailing list, you're tired of the mailing list, you just unsubscribe. The peer-to-peer and the P2P protocol, it's also an association and assembly issue because it allows for collective collaboration. Ideally, it would be without the need for centralized servers, but there's very different models of that, and this took us to a next question that I will talk about in a couple of minutes. And then the issue of forced association. We're thinking about denial of services attacks. As I said, there's apparently a consensus within the Human Rights Protocol Considerations Research Group that there's some denial of services attacks that are legitimate, there's some that are not, but the IETF should not be making those distinctions in terms of content. That's from a free speech perspective, but taken from an association and assembly right perspective, we ask ourselves two things. First, if the denial of services attacks put in risk the entire internet architecture, so to speak, could this be an illegitimate form of association because they, and given that the internet is an association itself, if we are able to concede that, if we put at risk the internet as an association, could that be an illegitimate association form that should not be promoted in terms of architecture? That's one question. And then the other, must be taken into consideration that DDoS attacks are also a form of forced assembly and association, because most times and sometimes they are done without the agreement or even the knowledge of the involved parts. And the Internet of Things has brought interesting discussions regarding that. With ISPs, the logic of forced association is the same, because if an edge user, the edge user needs to accept the policies and practices of the edge networks that provides access to other networks. like for the user to connect, to join the assembly of the network of networks of the internet, if we are ready to concede that, they always have to connect through an intermediary. And while connected to an intermediary, well, not always, but let's just say most of the time, while connected through the intermediary, they're forced to accept the policies, practices, and principles of this network. So can we say that internet connection through ISPs is a form of forced association? Next, please. We've also been discussing which model is better for freedom of assembly and association, centralized or decentralized, and why. Both things seem to have their pros and cons. Decentralized models, they protect anonymity and privacy. They are usually more resilient networks and more resistant to censorship mechanisms, but also centralized structures have enabled people to group together to identify each other better. They recognizable places, more visible, and also in some other cases, they enable for quicker interactions and even dissemination of information. So can we say one is better than the other? Yes, no, and why? I'd love to think. I'd love to hear out what you think on that. Next, please. So just a quick set of preliminary conclusions. The internet does impact the ability for people to exercise their right to freedom of assembly and association. And then can we think and assert that the internet itself is a form of association and assembly, and therefore it should be protected as such? This would be very interesting because of the consequences, the legal consequences it would have. And as I was saying, the consequences it might have on other networks. And then to get access to the internet, one could argue one is caught in a forced assembly with the access network. Next, please. That's it. Comments? Are we missing something? Did we mess something up or anything like that? Thank you very much.
Thanks so much for the presentation, Gisela. I see there are some comments in the Jabber room, but I hope I get people in the queue, and I see there is a queue forming. Please come in. Please state your name for the record.
My name is Tara from IETF. Very interesting presentation. I was I started thinking about lots of things. I don't have a specific question, but so think about like freedom of association. Freedom of association to join groups or lead groups. So I was thinking if the internet is an association, then what about the freedom, for example, to leave the internet or the right to be offline? Is that something that we should also consider, like when developing standards for people to use the internet, also have to build alternatives? Thank you.
Gisela, do you hear the question?
Hi, sorry. Actually, we had a bit of a problem with the microphone, so can you repeat that question for me? I couldn't hear you. Oh, interesting. So Tara was asking how about the right to be offline? Is that right?
Yes, and as it is, so because previously we discussed it, but I've never really looked at it, like, to be offline from the point of view from freedom of association. So I was just an idea that came up, and I was wondering if that's something that kind of came up in your research when you were thinking about the internet as an association.
Well, hi, Tara. Not yet. We actually didn't think about that, but I think it's very interesting. Thank you for bringing it up. So essentially, if we are willing to concede that the internet is an association, then of course you would have the right to not be part of that association, because that would be forced association, and maybe that could be interpreted as a right to be offline, right? I mean, that's where my mind is right now, but it's super interesting. I'm wondering if from other rights perspective, we can also build on the right to be offline, and also how would that relate on a totally different level. For example, if you could get delisted or erased from the internet eventually because you want to be offline because of your otherwise they would be forcing you to an association that you do not want to be part of. Can you actually
protest, then what would it be? So that was actually the origin story of the draft.
I understand, but I think there may be value in whether it's this draft or just a two-page document that says even the people taking part in this research group have been convinced that yes, DDoS is just an attack and nothing else. That I think might be useful.
Thanks so much, Gisela. Thanks so much for calling in from Mexico and for staying up. We don't hear you anymore. Oh, we're kind of lost in space now. But at least it was nice for when it lasted. Okay, yeah, so we lost audio, but thanks so much, Gisela. So we continue with the next draft, for which I'd like to ask Andrew Sullivan to come forward.
Hi there. Oh, I even get to drive. My name is Andrew Sullivan, and I'm here to talk a little bit about a draft that Niels and I put together, but I hope that mostly I won't talk and you all can tell us how wrong we are. So I just want to give a quick outline of what this thing is about and what we've described in here and some issues that have already come up in discussion on the list, and then we can maybe have some discussion here. So some of you will remember that I was one of the critics of this claim that protocols are political that was in the HRPC research document. There was some back and forth about it, and I think the document ended up a little bit weaker than it had been. But also, some of those claims are still in there, and I think that there's been some discussion about it. So we wanted to understand, Niels and I wanted to understand what the possible positions are about this, and then try to distinguish among them so at least we could understand them. And then maybe, and I think he's more optimistic about this than I am, but maybe we could answer whether there really is a political dimension automatically to protocols. And so we've got some described positions. The first one is just this value neutral position, which is a position that it has a very old tradition, but there are people who continue to think this today. So the values are all analogies here with mass media development or traffic or dams and rivers, that kind of thing. Where they change the world and they make the world different. there's been some suggestion actually that because of this, we've got some category mistakes in the document, that some things are not in this category that should be, or maybe there are some things in this category that should be in the next one. The last of these positions is that the protocols are inherently political. So this is the position that was controversial before, and so obviously we were trying to make it as clear as possible here. And this is the one, and I think Bob was sort of suggesting this earlier at the microphone. I think this is something that Niels believes, that the protocols are fundamentally politics by other means. You're making decisions, and you're making political decisions fundamentally. There is some people read the Postman things. There's a bunch of stuff from Neil Postman in here, and some people read Postman actually to say the previous category of stuff. I don't know what Postman says a lot of the time, so I'm not too keen on adjudicating that dispute. In any case, those are the positions that we were trying to outline. Now, we identified some issues. In the 00, we hadn't defined politics or political, and it seemed that there were a number of cases where we were stumbling over that. So the 01 that's already out, but probably you haven't read it, has attempted to give a definition of that. This is the working one, and it's there on the screen, or you can read it on your own screens later if you would like. But it seemed pretty obvious that this draft is going to go absolutely nowhere if we don't come up with some definition here. So we've done that. There are some other examples that people sent us feedback that we should include. We didn't include the Raven process, but I guess we probably better. Maybe we need some more discussion of RFC 6973. Maybe there are some other cases. So if you have some other cases that we ought to be looking at, we are keen to hear about them. Elliot Lear had a really interesting set of remarks about how the document says the IETF is not the protocol police. And of course, it is true that we can't go out and force people to use our protocols or anything like that. But there is a nifty little thing here, right? So we're quite aggressive, actually, about our IPR rules. The IETF is extraordinarily strict about what you may and may not do. So much so, in fact, that authors of documents that are being published in the IETF can't put them under different terms. They have to go into the IETF terms. They can put the document, the same document, under other terms somewhere else, but they can't publish them as an RFC. This has come up several times because people wanted to put Creative Commons licenses on things and so on, and it's not allowed. And the reason for that is because the IETF's IPR position is that it wants to control derivative works so that some other standards organization can't come along, swallow the thing up, and then close it with a change or something like that. So that there's a practical reason for this. Well, that's a kind of protocol policing, right? What that is an attempt to enforce certain kinds of abilities of other people to do stuff with the work product of the IETF. So depending on how you interpret protocol police, there's a potential thing here, and I think we're going to work a little bit harder to tease this out some more. I think in the document it's not there yet, but it would be interesting. There was also this other question about a single vendor end-to-end thing. Like, is that a different political kind of situation? We have a lot of these now, right? There's a lot of stuff deployed on the internet, very widely deployed on the internet, that is end-to-end controlled by a single vendor. And maybe that changes something about it. So we want to investigate that. Okay, so these are the questions that we have anyway. First of all, whether this is at all useful, or maybe it's just useless and we can stop. If we updated this, would we get any more reviews? Also, we want to know if people think this is actively harmful, because there's lots of stuff that you can write down that you shouldn't. And obviously, there's probably stuff we've missed. So I invite you to tell us what we've done well or badly. I think that's it, right? Yeah.
Great, we've got a few. Please.
This is Shane Kerr. Well, I think certainly you have expressed a number of concerns several times throughout this research group. And I think there can't be anything wrong with writing them down in a structured format like this and making them more clear. So I think if nothing else, the process of writing the document, I hope, is helpful for people, observers like me, who often didn't follow the discussion between our philosophers up at the front there. So now whether or not that means it actually needs to be moved forward into a document, I can't say. I think there's no harm, especially in a research group, of publishing it as an RFC though.
Stefan Bartsmeyer speaking. I have two concerns with your draft. One is that it seems there is a lot of overlap with HRPC research draft, because are protocols political is already the basic question of the research draft. Maybe one way to solve this overlap would be to focus on explaining to people, because the research draft is very hard to read. It's a lot of things, a lot of discussion. So maybe a short draft focusing on the ordinary IETF participant and explaining what is the discussion about our protocols political could be useful, because in the current state, it's not clear of what is the purpose of the HRPC political draft. And the second concern is the section on the voluntary standards. It's not clear for me if it refers to volunteer in the elaboration, in the creation of standards, the IETF work is done by volunteers, this sort of thing, or is it about adoption and implementation of standard by the rest of the world, which is when we created a standard, will people have to deploy it or not, which is the whole question of protocol police. So it seems to me that the current section 9 completely mix the two things.
Okay, thank you.
Thank you, Georg Meyer speaking. I think on the protocol police, I would think you could extend it. But so far as I understand, you say it's about IPRs and who creates and owns the protocol, but the ownership, in fact, also includes how you can extend the protocol. And we had issues in the past where practically from an outside body, we wanted to extend the protocol, and the IETF said no for technical reasons, nothing to do with human rights or political reasons. But I think it shows that the owner of a protocol has a certain power over what can be really done with it and where it can be applied. And that is something that is not just in the beginning, but also in the involvement of the protocol, and maybe also when it comes to evolution into a new protocol. Because if you do something today, and then a new generation is needed, everybody will look into this room and say, what do they have to say, right? So that's maybe also something you want to add there.
So this is very interesting, but could you say a little more about the cases where somebody wants to extend it and the IETF says in effect no? I mean, I can think of some examples of that, but some of them are more controversial than others. So if you could say a little more.
I mean, I work with 3GPP, right? So when we came in the beginning and wanted to do practically the circuit switch network with SIP, then there was a lot of controversy saying practically SIP is not meant for that. We were able, I think, to 99% of these cases to resolve one way or the other. Some things like charging, lawful interception, and so on, they will stay problematic and always give rise for discussion. But I mean, we have a way of resolving that, and I don't want to judge whether this is good or not. I just say the fact that the IETF forced us to practically delay our work for quite a while shows how powerful the IETF is. At that point, it was painful for us. In the work that you want to undergo here, it might be a factor that could be used in a positive manner. The other thing that came to my mind, I didn't say that before, was when we talk about such things, is it then really still the protocol, or is it not more the protocol and who does the protocol? So there are two things that can evolve, right? The technical things that are written down and the group of people that governs it.
Right.
Not sure if this is addressed in the draft.
I think it's very weak right now, and I think that's an important point that I think is a little bit obscure right now.
Okay. Thank you very much.
Hello, Tara, OTF. Thank you for the presentation. I wanted to challenge the notion that technology is value neutral. I think you cannot, technology derives its values from its uses, so these values also apply to the technology itself. One way I'd like to illustrate this is like using the concept of like Maslow's hammer. So if the only tool you have is a hammer, then all your problems start to look like nails. And so I think like that's one way that illustrates why it's important to not only consider technology by itself, but also consider the whole set of its uses when determining its values. Thank you. So,
but you're not disputing that there are people who think that the technology is neutral and all of those values are actually in the humans.
I think those people are wrong.
Yeah.
Okay.
I think the extreme position in the other direction is wrong, but we're trying to lay it out. So okay, thanks. That's helpful.
Alfredoria speaking personally. I think it's actually very useful to be working this out. And I think it's especially useful at this point to sort of work out that whole notion of protocol police, which is something we talk about frequently, which is police of the protocol as a protocol versus police of how the protocols are used, where one is indeed the case and the other isn't. So I think it's very good because that conversation is always somewhat ambiguous, and defining it and getting past that ambiguity is a good thing. So I think if it were just for that, it would be worth it, because that is a conversation that needs to be had and understood. So thanks.
Hey, Stephen Powell. Yeah, I'm not at all sure if this is useful. So there, I can see that there are those kind of more inward-looking and more outward-looking scopes. That's a fair point, I think. But I'm not clear whether either of them is useful to try and document that is. It might be, and I think the discussion will be irresistible. So maybe this is one where if you guys are still willing to push it along, then see where it goes, and we'll see. But yeah, I mean, I would be concerned that what you said, basically, that there are some things that are not written down sometimes.
Right. So then I guess the question that I would have is what would you say to Stefan's point before, that the research document is actually, it's got all the survey of the literature and all the rest of it in it, and so for a lot of sort of IETF participants, it's a little opaque, and so maybe this is the quick and dirty guide to painless thinking about this or something.
Yeah. No, I'm not saying I'm anti this. I'm saying I just don't know. Right?
Yeah.
I don't know if you can kind of lay out all the various positions different people have in a way that's understandable to the IETF community, and still short and understandable to the IETF community. So,
right.
I'm fairly clear that I don't think you want to kind of pick one and say this is the right answer.
I'm not too sanguine about the possibility of that myself.
Right. If the choice
but I'm also not convinced. I'm also not sure that the IETF community really wants an introduction to Heidegger.
We have you for that, right?
Shortly speaking to the overlap on between the research draft and this draft, I think that the claim that we work out in the research draft is that protocols have an impact on human rights, which is a very different claim than politics are political. So you can say, yes, human rights are political, but that doesn't make it the same. And I think what we do here is that we dive in a similar way as we do with the association draft, is that we look much closer. So we zoom in deeper and we analyze the case further. So the research draft was kind of seeing whether this research area makes sense at all and come up with guidelines. And now we're like at the next iteration to try to understand what are the specific problems. Did the initial guidelines make sense? And what are the ways to approaching and documenting this? And because this is a topic that comes back and again and again and again on the list and in discussions, it is very nice to have a shorthand to say, yes, we talked about that. Let's have a look there.
Stephen Farley, and yeah, but I mean, you know, maybe this is something that would be better as an academic publication, and then when that's a kind of a done thing, to try and reflect that in an internet draft form as to be understandable by the IETF community. You know, it might be better that analysis is not thrashed out in the typical kind of IETF style. I'm not sure. I'm not arguing to not do this, but I'm just not sure it's useful.
So this has been helpful to me. My conclusion from what I've heard is that at least one more iteration of this would be helpful, and at that point we can decide whether any further work is useful. So I think we'll have another go round.
Thank you.
So here we get to the presentation of the hackathon, HTTP status code 451, and there we have the combination of 2 offline presenters and an online presenter. Olga Krusteleva, Alp Toker, please come ahead and stand in the purple box. And is Meet Echo working again? And if so, Shivan, can you put yourself in the queue so we have you on the screen? There's Shivan. Great to have you there. Meet Echo, can we have Shivan large on screen? Great, good to see you there. I will give the controls to Alp, and I'm sure among the three of you, you can make it work.
So I can tell that some of you are quite interested in implementation as well as the policy, and perhaps you've been waiting for a bit to see how these things play out. So we're going to look at some of the things we've done to monitor and track the success and the implementation of RFC 7725. So that's the HTTP status code 451. So we were at the hackathon and we got the implementation. So I'm Alp Toker. This is Olga Krusteleva, Ava, and so this is what we're doing. The hackathon, which got the best new work. So it went quite well, and at the hackathon we built tools that basically track that they crawl and detect cases of censorship online. So it was a matter of really trying to see if this RFC is in use, it's deployed. It's a way of declaring incidents of legally withheld content online. So it's also quite a diverse participation from groups that you may not see in other spaces and working groups, because it's represented by civil society. And I suppose part of the goal is to bridge the gap between policy and tech. So I think that was Shiva wanting to maybe look at some of the implementation. Is that right? Or okay.
I think,
first. Okay. So the purpose, like I said, is really to add some transparency, improve tracking, and also to understand how the if it can be implemented, if these specs can be implemented and used in practice, and what flaws there are. So you find that HTTP 403, for example, isn't necessarily suitable for this kind of task. So the implementations, there were, I think, 6 implementations in total. There was a crawler which scans the web, WordPress plugin which implements the actual status code, and a daemon that collects all the data and centralizes it, the block collector, and a browser extension, a Chrome extension that allows users to report incidents that they detect online as they browse. And also an alternative crawler which validated some of the standards or some of the specs we built to really relay censorship data in JSON. So part of the goal is also to build a standard, well, a beginning of perhaps a description of incidents or observations of blocked content.
Hey, I can talk about this. Hey, by the way, hello, I'm Shivan. Is there a lot of echo?
No, we hear you just fine, Shivan. Continue. Okay. Could be a bit louder, Meet Echo team, so that would be great.
So yeah, I'm Shivan. I'm dialing in from Ottawa, Canada, and I'll briefly go over all the components of the hackathon and then talk about the implementation with my draft. So this is the block crawler. It calls for instances of 451 status and reports them to the collector. In this example, we see it being used to insert key on a list of blocked subreddits. Next slide, please. So we have, this is the WordPress plugin. This is used by operators to report to users that content is blocked instead of simply taking it down. So the operator can specify like area of the block, as you can see, and also provide a message. And optionally, they can also report this block to the collector. Next slide. So this is the block collector itself. And so all the different reports of status code 451 from the different sources all flow into this. And it can be used for analysis of the block. Plus, you could see blocks as they happen in real time. And a link to the dashboard is included at the end of the presentation. Next slide, please. So this is the Chrome extension. So on visiting a web page that serves 451 or has sub-resources that have been served with status code 451, the user is provided with an option to report it. Yeah, next slide. So this is an alternative crawler to the one previously we saw, and it's a desktop-based one. Yeah, and as mentioned previously, we won the best work at the IETF hackathon last week. Next slide, please. So yeah, I'll be, as part of our work last week, we also created an implementation report there to examine how the status code is being used currently, who is using it, and how it could improve. And I'll be going through different parts of the report. So first part is stakeholders. So the two main classes are implementers, and implementers are servers of block resources, and also intermediaries like ISPs and CDNs. And the users are browsers that decide how to handle 451 response. Also users and researchers who are interested in trends around internet censorship. Next is current usage. We saw that a majority of the blocks only serve the status code with no explanation for why the block happened. Blocks are often based on geographical IPs, and the block by field parameter, as described in the original RFC 725, was almost always missing. The potential impact, so HTTP status code 451 is a prime example of an internet protocol that enables policy objectives, in this case, transparency. The status code is machine readable, which allows for crawlers and the kind of tools we built at the hackathon. It can be useful for measuring censorship across the internet and seeing trends. But there's also concern around privacy when reporting cases of blocks, because this information can be used to identify users who have accessed block resources. So what are the useful features of a reporting mechanism? Given the various ways in which 451 is consumed, a unified data format is essential. And the reports themselves have to have relevant information. So this leads to what the current features are and like suggestions for improvements. So the fields and descriptions of the 451 response are not standardized enough, at least. In most cases, we don't get to know why the block happened in the first place or who demanded it. This is essential information. And we feel, as a suggestion, guidance, perhaps through an implementation guide, would be very useful to spread the status code. And also documenting common descriptions as to why the block happened could also be useful. For the last part of the report, we talked about legal frameworks, and we did some case studies on different countries. We examined different ways in which governments legally censor their citizens, and in the interest of time, I'll only mention broad trends. So we saw that geo-blocking the IP address is pretty common. Keeping terms of freedom of expression laws vague or gradually expanding them over the years also happens frequently. ISP blocking is pretty common in Iran and India. And in the US, legal blocking in case of copyright law takes a form of notice and takedown. So to summarize, the status code is a useful way of providing information about a legal block, but standardization work needs to be done before it can see widespread usage. Yeah, that's it for me.
And in the draft, we try to consider all of these that you can see in the screen and talk about what possible implications status code 451 can have for this. And I guess there are a couple that are more relevant than others or more concerning than others. And so one of them was privacy and anonymity, because if the user tries to access the website or web page that is blocked, he or she often would get a 451 response, but then would get redirected. So that could include potential privacy breaches, and it mean that the user can be identified. The same is because the 451 is cached by definition, so there is a trace of that the user tried to access blocked content on his or her computer. So if the computer is lost, like it's possible to retrieve this information. And also the observers of the network have access to see who tried to access the blocked content. So those are some of the biggest concerns. In terms of censorship, it's a great tool of censorship monitoring. It doesn't solve the problem of censorship, and we want to make it to a point that it's not okay to censor using 451, because it's not okay to censor point. So it's not a way to make censorship more ethical. More than anything, it's just a way for the user to sort of see why they cannot access certain content. Because as we mentioned in the draft, the response should include the legislation, like the link to which law is applied and why the content is blocked, and also who made the decision, whether it was a court decision or which governmental body actually asked for the content to be blocked. I guess we would like to try to run the crawler in different countries and to see what content is blocked. We did it. We did a small test run on Reddit in Turkey, and some LGBT content appeared to be blocked using 451. And so we are currently working on running it in Russia, and potentially there are more countries where we would like to try it and to sort of monitor and measure censorship. And yeah, we'll gladly share them with you on the next IETF meetings.
It's just worth noting, one of the outcomes from all of this that I think is worth noting is that the language, or at least the way we think about this, changed slightly over the course of the work we did. And we found that there's maybe less of a desire to encourage the adoption of 451, but more to actually track it. Because there's a risk that you might end up actually sanctioning these acts of micro censorship instead of making them more transparent. So there's always balance to be had between encouraging a standard and putting it out there so that people can use it when they need it. So that might be one of the things that's needing clarification, perhaps, in a revision. So we do have a few resources here that you can look at. There's the code online at GitHub, and there's a live demo as well at netblocks.org/dashboard, which is an outcome of this work.
Thank you. Are there any questions? Anybody at the mic? I don't see anybody at the mic. Anybody heading to the mic? Okay.
This is Bill Newnighton speaking. I just tried to understand this thing. I read the RFC just right now. And what I'm wondering is, I understand that also intermediaries like providers could be handing out this kind of 451 code to block content on behalf of the government or whatever. Are there any considerations if HTTPS is used or DNSSEC is used where this kind of thing doesn't work anymore so well? Have there already been some consideration? If yes, what were they?
Right, so it is possible to inject a 451 page in a ISP intercepted page load, HTTP resource load, if it's not encrypted. Like you say, with TLS, HTTPS, there's a separate set of problems. The content isn't visible to the intercepting party. At the moment, 451 use is really envisioned for use by the entity from which the legal block has been requested. It's the actual publisher which restricts its own content. So yes, there is a desire in cases where authorities use block pages already to have them delivered with a 451 status code. But realistically, there's no desire or plan to put this in any way in terms of intercepting HTTPS content. I think in that case, it's completely up to the publisher on how to do that or whether to do that. And I think, well, personally, I think that's the way it should be, and that's certainly how the RFC is at the moment.
Well, just to add, I'm not like defending like what's going to happen with blocking in the internet. I just see these problems now while fighting against blocking.
Absolutely.
Stephen Farrell, so just a question. I think you kind of mentioned it, is that there's, you know, if people start using this and then you go up and measure it, in some sense that could disincent people from using it, because then you've measured it and you might report on that, right? Have you thought about kind of ways of collating results, or not anonymizing them necessarily, but and maybe you've done this already, of reporting out on regional or functional or some aspects of what's blocked without necessarily calling out the person who's publishing the 451?
Yes, we started to look at this, and one of the ideas we have is to use the IP anonymization, IP address anonymization work that's going on at the moment, where we can choose a K sample to create a more anonymous grouping because we don't want to provide the actual physical IP address,
sure,
but we do want to give an idea of which ASNs, which regions are impacted. So in terms of monitoring, these are questions that we're looking at, and we need to answer these questions so that we can publish actual useful data. But you know, in the time given so far, we haven't really done an anonymization or geo implementation at the moment.
Yeah, I mean, I guess the reason to ask is, you know, let's say in a networking context, it's a natural thing to go and, you know, do some kind of surveying or use ZMAP or something, and then publish traces, maybe anonymized or something. But in this case, if you publish the URLs that you find, that's not so good, right?
That's another problem. I mean, one of the ideas we had before is maybe to put the URL in a image, but that also has accessibility issues. And one of the other ideas we have is in the protocol, perhaps to encode the URL so that it's not in clear text, because there's a risk. If you have a list of all these, I suppose, blocked sites, then crawlers are going to consider your own site, which hosts the transparency report, as a dangerous site. So in our current protocol, we do specify an encoding of URLs, which I think all implementations have switched to at the moment. So the the 451 URLs are actually base 64 encoded in the current spec of the protocol, simply so they're not visible and they don't become a problem to people passing around the data.
Okay, so that's one thing. It's just kind of accidentally mistaking this for the resource that is censored.
Yes, or even just clicking on it in your editor. You find text editors have that feature, which is dangerous.
Yeah. Yeah, I don't know. Okay, thanks.
Thanks, and I'll close the
So
queue.
just to add to that,
Okay. I want to add that this is really dangerous, what we're doing here. Let's say I'm part of the fight against internet censorship since many years, and we are trying to organize, you know, if this is just a joke, 451, and then it can be used as a form of protest, right, in the internet. So if they force you to remove something, you put a 451 on it, and as a protest, a sign of protest that this should not be, right? And on the other side, if we start to take it serious, then we are kind of legitimating the end of freedom of speech, you know? So we are kind of organizing a measure where the enemies of freedom of speech can say, well, we're just complying. And so I just want to put the warning here on the table that this can be really dangerous if we take it too serious, this very special RFC.
Well, thank you for your comment. I think we're aware of this. I guess the idea behind it is that they are already doing it. And for example, in Russia, 451 is used a lot by because there are different laws that are regulating internet. There is the law about bloggers being distributors of mass information, and so if you don't register in a certain registrar, your site can be blocked. And so there are various laws that are for a like a citizen who is not very much into tech. It's like, okay, it's blocked by law, then it's sort of a valid reason for blocking. You know what I mean? So if you don't know what the law is about exactly, and that a law is actually kind of a censorship law, you might think that, oh, whatever, yeah, there is a reason. Because also, and I guess it's worth mentioning that some of this content is like pornography or online gaming, which can, like, I mean, censorship is I guess we have to define it as well, because it's a very, I don't know, like the line is a thin line between censorship and what's not censorship. So I guess we have to distinguish in between that. But it's a way, I guess, of measuring something that already exists rather than encouraging compliance with the status code.
Okay, maybe I should add then, as an answer on what you said, maybe the view in Russia can be very different from what I said. I don't know the situation there. I can talk about the view in Germany, where we are really fighting internet censorship, and it's really a tough one because they really want it. The government wants it. And it's also a discussion, even in Switzerland, you know, known as a free country. Again, we have internet censorship on the table politically, and there is where I was commenting. Okay.
Thank you. I had closed the queue. We've got 4 minutes left, so really it's a discussion to take to the list, and because I have a feeling it's going to go on for a bit. But sorry, but I had asked to close the queue. Thank you very much, and hopefully we can continue the discussion on the list.
And from what I've heard, there's a good chance that there will be a hackathon on this again in Singapore.
So really, good thing to discuss on the list. Okay, just a quick update on the status. Since the last time, draft IRTF HRPC research has gone through the IRSG review, and I guess it is just about to go into the IESG conflict check and IANA review, but Allison is coming to the microphone, so can put me straight.
To be completely clear, I can do it anytime you tell me to do it. So
I believe we're ready. Right.
Yeah. Okay. Yeah. All right. Awesome.
Thank you.
See that
yes.
happen.
No. Throughout this week, nothing new came up that needed to be, and even through today's meeting, nothing came up that needed to be changed. So I think we're fine. Thank you.
Okay. RFC ahead.
Okay. Thank you very much.
Woo.
And with only 2 minutes left, I don't know that there's a lot of time for open discussion of the drafts, papers, and ideas. So I would just like to say that submit them to the list and we'll get them talking. Did anybody have a quick something they wanted to say, like, there is my paper on blah, and you should all check it out? If not, please use the list. It's got some discussion on it sometimes. It could use a bunch more. And with that, there's an open mic for a whole minute and a half.
Also, the co-chairs, I think, would also really appreciate input on that we changed our format, made the meeting a bit longer, had a longer talk. So comments on that, whether it was good, bad, should do it differently at the mic or afterwards would be great.
Because we did change it because there were comments last time. So we want to see if we did the right thing in changing it. At this point, seeing nobody at the mic and nobody with anything to say, I guess we had a whole minute extra that I could have let people talk earlier, but thank you. And thanks for coming, even though there was a bunch of other good stuff going on at the same time. Please be active on the list. Please come up with new drafts. Thanks. Oh. Does anybody still need to sign the blue?
Please do so then we get a room again next time.